Hey guys, so today we're going to replace the valve cover on this Infiniti G35 sedan. The process is very similar for the G37, FX, and DX SUVs. We started noticing leaks on both sides of the valve cover, probably due to failing gaskets, so let's take care of it before it gets worse. This is the passenger side and the driver's side. All the tools used in the video will be linked in the description. Let's start by disconnecting the battery and removing the engine cover that's held on by a few 10mm bolts. We'll remove the intake and the attached hoses. We have an aftermarket intake on this car, but most of you will have the stock air boxes. The only difference is you will need to remove those air boxes, and they're held on by a couple of 10mm bolts. Most of the bolts that will need to be removed are 10mm. Let's take off the evap canister and assembly that's located on the rear of the plenum. Using needle nose pliers makes it much easier to remove those hoses. We're going to remove the plenum bolts. There's a total of 8. The throttle bodies have several coolant hoses that need to be removed. Two more bolts holding the plenum. A couple of more hoses and we should be able to remove the plenum. There we go. Cover the intake manifold with a clean shop towel so we don't get any debris down there. Unbolt, disconnect, and set the ignition coils aside. Using a swivel socket adapter and an extension will make it easier to reach the bolts near the firewall where space is limited. We need to remove the hose that is blocking one of the bolts. Remove the remaining bolts. This is the VVT solenoid and camshaft position sensor. They're each secured by a single bolt. Before we remove the valve cover, we want to make sure to blow away any dirt. The cable harness gets in the way a bit, but if you push it to the side, you'll be able to pull the valve cover off relatively easily. We're going to carefully clean these two corners and reapply RTV or silicone gasket before installing the new valve cover. We also clean the perimeter where the valve cover gasket makes contact. Once cleaned, we can apply the RTV. Install the gaskets on the new valve cover. The gasket comes with tabs that line up with the valve cover, so it's hard to mess up. Depending on your Infiniti model, the gaskets that seal the spark plug wells might be permanent, which means you need to replace the whole valve cover like we're doing here. Time to install the new valve covers. Make sure the gasket is securely installed. If the gasket gets pinched or falls out of place, it will cause leaks, so take your time and double check everything. Don't forget, the RTV dries after a certain period of time, so make sure it doesn't sit for too long, otherwise it may dry out and cause leaks. Follow the instructions on the RTV that you choose. Once the valve cover is on, check the perimeter and make sure it's sitting evenly. Now, reinstalling the bolts is a two-step process. First, install the bolts in order, 1 through 12, as you see in the diagram. Torque them down to 18-inch pounds. Next, we tighten them in the same order, 1 through 12, and torque them down to 73-inch pounds. We're also replacing the spark plugs. Let's add a little bit of anti-seize to the threads on the new spark plugs before we install. We recommend threading them by hand to start. First, a few turns to the left, then tighten them to the right by hand to avoid any cross-threading. Ignition coils go back in. Make sure the wires are going to the correct spark plug. Otherwise, you will notice it immediately. Rough idle, shaking, and the engine may even shut off on you. We accidentally switched up the spark plugs and had this happen to us. Don't forget to reinstall the VVT solenoid and camshaft position sensor as well. This is the next day. We're working on the passenger side. It's essentially the same process. We used a bungee cord to hold the wire harness out of the way. The bolts come off. A magnetic pickup tool is always helpful to avoid dropping bolts into the engine bay. You'll need to remove this metal fuel line and fuel damper. It's held down by a couple of 10mm bolts. Same deal on this side. The most difficult part is getting the wire harness out of the way for leverage to pull the valve cover. It's finally off, but part of the harness is still attached. Flip it over and use needle nose pliers to unclip it. Let's clean the two corners that has old RTV silicone. You can use a blade or a scraper tool. Be careful when doing this. RTV goes on the two front corners. The rear doesn't require it. Again, remember, the RTV should go up about 2 inches as shown here. Similar process on this side. Carefully install the new valve cover, making sure the gasket stays in place. Take your time and be careful with this. Same torque specs for the bolts on the passenger side. New spark plugs on this side as well. Make sure not to over tighten them. Ignition coils are next. Don't forget the VVT solenoid and camshaft position sensor. The G37 valve cover doesn't have a space for the VVT solenoid and camshaft position sensor, so you don't have to worry about it. Plug the ignition coils back in. Reinstall the PCV hose on the front side of the engine. Reinstall the fuel damper that includes the metal hoses. New gasket on the plenum. Reinstall the plenum. Make sure to reconnect all the hoses behind the plenum and on the throttle body as well. We had a few coolant leaks coming from these hoses after reinstalling them. They're pretty old, so it makes sense just to replace them. Reinstall the intake. Don't forget the sensors. Reconnect the battery and we're ready to test the car. We noticed some white smoke coming from this area. These are the hoses that I just mentioned. There was a little bit of coolant dripping from these hoses, so we readjusted them. It solved the problem for the time being, but to be on the safe side, just replace them with new ones. It'll prevent leakage in the future. If you found this information useful, we would appreciate it if you would subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us out a ton. Thank you for watching.